So we talked about antibiotic resistance and arms races in general. So antibiotic resistance is one of the two things we talked about. Some organisms produce chemicals that kill other bacteria, then those bacteria have an evolutionary pressure. There's this force that selects for any of the bacteria in the second species that are resistant to the original antibiotic, and then there's this back and forth co-evolution and arms race. Who can beat who? So we've got arms races. What was the other example? Spend a little bit less time on it.
Oh, the queen, red queen.
So the concept was the red queen is another term for an arms race. When there's back and forth evolution and nobody really ever wins, you just constantly spend all this energy trying to one-up the group, population, species you're competing with. Nobody ever really wins. You're spending all the energy you can just to stay in one place, as the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. The other example was poxvirus immune system, Red Queen. Coevolution, arms race. How there are proteins in poxviruses that are meant to suppress protein kinase R in our cells, which is our strategy to detect and destroy cells that are infected with poxviruses. Sets up another tug of war. The virus evolves to avoid our immune system. Our cells try to evolve to be able to recognize the evolving poxvirus proteins, and no one ever wins. It's just constant back and forth. That was what we talked about last class. Today, we start moving into phylogenetics, one of the most important topics, in my opinion, in evolutionary biology. This is the core concept that underpins pretty much everything else we'll talk about all semester. How to create representations of how different populations, different species are related to each other. And this all stems from the poll that you took on Friday. Most of you did. It was 0 points. It was just for me to collect data to show you this morning about how you think and approach interpreting phylogenetic trees. So one student on the first day of class asked everybody to write a short definition of what evolution means, or what evolution is. And one of the responses was it's the change of species from something simple to more complex, for example, humans. So in jest, I respond with these pictures and say, okay, who's really more complex? What species is truly the most evolved? Pardon?
The human.
The human? Okay. Does anybody agree or disagree?
I do both. I agree and disagree.
Oh man. That's deep for Monday morning. So please explain.
Well, humans they've been around the least as opposed to, I guess, chimpanzees or monkeys. So they've had more time to evolve and change over time because they've simply been around a lot longer than we have.
Ooh, so which species has been around longer, chimpanzees or humans?
Didn't they co-evolve? Didn't they separate this
Are we sister species? That is, did we both evolve from a common ancestor? If you agree with scientific evidence that says yes, then that suggests that both of the species have existed the same amount of time. Since our common ancestor split into two different populations at first, and then eventually two different species, chimpanzees and humans. And this is the essence of phylogenetics, trying to understand what are the relationships between different populations, different species. So the way this works, and we'll talk about this more later, is anytime you draw a phylogenetic tree, one of the axes, depending on which direction the tree is drawn, will be representing what? Time. In this case, past is at the bottom and present is at the top. where the branch tips exist. So on a phylogenetic tree, every tip of a branch represents an existing unit of organisms, be it population, species, genus, phylum, whatever. So in this case, this is two branch tips represent two different species, chimpanzees and humans. And what this phylogenetic tree would suggest is that there was a point in time when there was a single common ancestor that split, so as time progresses from past to present, that one population of coexisting and co-breeding organisms back in history, which doesn't look like modern-day chimpanzees or modern-day humans, it looked like whatever that population looked like in the past, split into two. And then over time, those two groups, populations or species, independently gained mutations, changes in appearance, physiology, morphology, behavior. And so we now occupy present time, as do some organisms that we bear a lot of similarities to, chimpanzees. So what's the correct answer to the question at the bottom? Which species is more complex or more evolved? Technically, what? Technically humans? Technically both? So this is one of the major, it's up to you. There is no right answer. But most evolutionary biologists would argue that as was suggested earlier, that every existing species is evolved. It exists. It has adapted, it has undergone evolutionary processes to become fit in its current environment. And so it's difficult to answer if you ask an evolutionary biologist one of these questions, they'll throw up their arms in exasperation. Now, complexity, maybe we could debate a little bit more.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So?
Yeah, I don't like the whole from something simple to more complex because I don't think that's a definition of what evolution necessarily is. Because who's to say that sometimes your environment changes, therefore you have to kind of revert back to an ancestral trait that is maybe not as complex, however you want to describe that, but I wouldn't say simple or complex.
Okay, so simple versus complex, it's sort of subjective. Depends on who you're talking to what complex means. Does it mean more cells? Does it mean more senses? What does it mean to be more complex? So evolutionary geneticists and evolutionary biologists tend to stay away from this debating complexity because it's a difficult thing to address. And so that's point number one. We don't usually talk about, in evolution anyway, about who's more simple, who's more complex. Might accidentally let that slip every once in a while, that word. I might say more complex or less complex. I try not to, though. And the other perspective of evolutionary biologists in general is that if you're an existing taxon, species, population, whatever, that you have evolved, there's no more evolved, less evolved distinction. Now, you might not agree with those, or you might not understand what I'm talking about yet, but I just wanted to start off with sort of this is the perspective of evolutionary biology as a discipline. Do you have any questions at this point now? This is a great place to have discussions, debates. If you have concerns or your own personal opinions on any of those topics. So some of these should look familiar. One of these is the phylogenetic tree that you looked at on Friday when you took a survey to try to interpret what these different trees represent. So a quarter of you saw tree A, a quarter of you saw tree B, etc. So now I'm revealing my hand. I'm showing my hand. Right? I'm doing scientific experiments on you. Yeah, you're welcome. It's to improve, or to demonstrate anyway, I think a really important point. So what I'm going to ask you now is, by yourself, think about which of these four trees do you think is the most likely correct representation of the relationships between these species? Okay. Then, when you're ready, go to Socrative and answer the one question there. We're not asking for, you don't have to put in your name or ID number or anything. I just want anonymous responses. Which of these trees is most likely shows the correct relationships between these species? It'll take about 3 or 4 minutes to do this. So basically 25% of the class chose each of these 4 answers. Does somebody want to take a stance verbally, publicly, and share why you felt strongly about which one of the 4 you chose?
I said none, but it was because it seemed like everything was equal distant away from each other.
Okay, so we've got a few people who feel strongly about all of the above. You must be the very few people that actually voted. Who voted all of the above? Okay, so explain why. So what do you see in these trees that suggests that they're all, you can't decide, A, B, C, D, none of the above. So it's not just A, it's not just B, it's not just C, it's not just D.
I think they're all just a different version of the same one.
Yeah. Like, so birds and crocodiles are equal distant away from each other in everyone. So, like, if you look at everything, the relationships split off at the same kind of distance away.
Okay, so in all of these 4 trees, for example, birds and crocodiles are what we call sister taxa. They're sister species. They're the most closely related to each other. How do we know that? By just looking at this figure?
It's the most recent ancestor.
It's the amount of time it took to go from sometime in the past to present on the right side of each of these trees, right? Every branch tip represents present day. So we have to go back least far in history to find a common ancestor between birds and crocodiles.
So A and C are just like split from each other.
So how are A and C related to each other?
Just the group is placed different, like the time is placed differently. Instead of going like up and to the right, it's going like down and to the right.
Yeah, so how are A, what did I do to,
It's like mirrored.
yeah, what did I do to tree A to make tree C?
And D are mirrors too.
I flipped it upside down.
D would be like that too.
Okay. So A and C are related to each other, and B and D are related to each other by taking the same image and just flipping it upside down. Okay. So A and C are exactly the same thing. The shape of the tree is the same. We're just looking at it upside down. What about how A and B are related to each other?
So like A kind of groups turtles, mammals, frogs, and fish. Birds, crocodiles, turtles, and mammals together. And then B does the same thing. It's like it still has fish and frogs as an outlier. It just rearranged it in a different way.
So that part's rotated.
Right. So to turn A into B, I took that group of 4 species and I flipped it upside down relative to where frogs and fish are. So frogs and fish stay the same. They're in the same places on those 2 trees. It's just this group of 4 has flipped upside down. What about C and D?
Inverse of each other.
I did exactly the same thing. We're allowed to do this with phylogenetic trees because the relationships between all 6 species stay the same anytime you rotate a branch. So you pick a node, any node, pick a node, any node. So a node is where branches come together, a point on the tree where there are multiple branches that split away. And you can freely rotate. You can flip all of the branches that lead away from that node just by rotating. And you haven't changed at all what this figure shows or depicts as the relationships between the species. For the organic chemist, it's like a single carbon bond. It spins. All the groups that are attached to one carbon can freely spin. You can diagram them in different ways, in different orientations, but that doesn't change the fact that you're still looking at the same organic molecule. Same thing is true for a phylogenetic tree. If you don't believe me, go home, grab a Lincoln Log set or a Tinker Toy or something like that. Build this. Use Legos, whatever. Sometimes we do this in class with pipe cleaners. It works equally well. And you can play with the orientation of the branches. You just spin different parts of the tree, and you can redraw the exact same tree in multiple different ways. So before really beating this dead horse to death, again, sorry, which of these trees most likely represents the true relationships between these species? All of them, because these are all the same tree, just rotated in different ways. The relationships between all the species are the same. So look at birds and crocodiles. All four of the panels, they're all sister taxa. They both, birds and crocodiles, share a common ancestor. What about fish? Where's fish in every one of these four trees? Fish are always at the bottom of the top. They always have the longest branch. Right? Fish always split off at the base of the tree in any one of these four. Means they've been evolving separately from all the other species the longest of all of the species that are shown on these trees. So then the group of species or species that branches first, that is longest to go on a tree, is referred to as the outgroup. It's the least like all of the other species because it shared a common ancestor here at that node, the longest to go in time. And what's the base of the tree called?
The root.
Right. So the root of the tree is the point in time longest to go. So each of one of these trees has a root. It's the farthest left point on the tree. Questions or concerns at this point? Okay. Let's move on to how you interpreted, when you didn't know that there were four different trees, when you were just focusing on a single tree, how you interpreted the relationships between these species. Let's see. There we go. So if you saw, here's how to interpret these. I asked two questions, right? One was, what does that say? Which organism is the most evolved? What's the correct answer? Either all of them or none of them.
That wasn't an option, though, I don't think.
That was not an option. I forced you to say which one is the most evolved. But, right? Tricky me. But so here's the interesting pattern, or please help me figure out what the interesting pattern is. There are four different trees that roughly a quarter of you saw one or the other of the four. And these bars, colored bars, it's a bar graph. It represents the proportion of the people that saw that graph that answered each of those different answers. So for example, graph A or tree A, there were only 3 answers out of the 6 possible. Some of you chose birds, some of you chose mammals, some of you chose fish. The majority of students that saw tree A answered birds. 64%, it says up there if you can read black on blue. 14% mammals, 21% fish. So who got the most votes? Birds. So most of the students that saw A said birds were the most evolved on this tree. My question to you is, help me figure out why that answer was chosen. The reason we're doing this is because I want to help you understand how to read trees. The point of this slide is that going into this, there's a lot of misconception about what the representation of a phylogenetic tree really means. Yeah.
So my reasoning behind thinking bird for A was because it looked like it branched off from all these other animals having the 5 nodes.
Right. Okay, so in A, so if I interpret what you're saying correctly, it's because there was the most recent splitting event
Yes.
led to birds.
Yeah, kind of like the one on the top, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, so you've hit it on the head. If you chose birds, and that was the reason,
Yeah.
why didn't you choose crocodiles? Which split at the exact same time. So they're also one of the most recently evolved, not most evolved, most recently evolved species shown up here, birds and crocodiles. Most recent split. Did anybody ever answer crocodiles? Yeah, there's like 1 vote in B, 1 vote in C, 2 or 3 votes in tree D. So very rarely did anybody say crocodiles were most evolved. So what is it about birds? Shown up here in blue. When did birds get the most votes? When they were on the top or the bottom. So please, 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 take home point number 1. Just because a species or population is at the top or the bottom or the very left or the very right does not mean that it is the most evolved or that all evolution led to that species. It just happens to be where it's drawn on the tree. This is repeating a lot of evolutionary research that's been done already on how students learn to interpret trees. That for most of us, we read left to right. And when I showed you these trees in the poll, they weren't actually oriented like this. These have been rotated 90 degrees. So when you looked at them, you would have read them left to right, and birds here would have been the first word that you read if you looked at the list of species from left to right. But obviously that doesn't make all of the difference because when it's on the very right or bottom of the tree, people still thought that birds over crocodiles were most evolved. So position on the tree does not tell us anything about who's most evolved. Beyond which there is no such thing as being most evolved. Yes, please.
Where does the tree start?
Where does the tree start?
Yeah, when you look at these,
Okay, let me sit down.
I have trouble interpreting where it starts.
Okay, so how do you interpret a phylogenetic tree? So that depends, and we'll get into this a lot more as we go through this chapter and the next chapter. It depends on the question you're asking, how you look at or how you read a tree. So let's say I was interested in understanding how flight evolved. Maybe I would look at a tree like this and ask myself, okay, at what point in time and in whose ancestor did I think wings evolved? So if I was going to ask that question, what would I do? I'd probably start at the base of the tree and try to figure out, okay, well, which organisms have wings? Which organisms fly? Birds. Okay. But also, bats aren't on the tree, so let's not talk about bats. But yes, indeed, we'd have to consider bats as well. But looking at just the types of organisms listed here, if I wanted to know when flight evolved, where on this tree, if you put a dot on a branch where you think flight evolved, where would you put it? Right. That would be what an evolutionary biologist would say. They'd say there were no wings until some point after crocodiles and birds split. So somewhere between the common ancestor of birds and crocodiles and present-day birds, there was that evolutionary adaptation. Wings evolved. Somewhere on this branch right there. So as time progressed, there was a common ancestor of all vertebrates. Fish started to diverge. Then later, there was a common ancestor of terrestrial vertebrates. Frogs diverged first. Then mammals began to diverge. Turtles, and then birds and crocodiles shared a common ancestor. So at moving from left to right, every branch split, every node represents some sort of divergence. Now, what pattern is true in A and C that's also true in B and D in terms of question 1, who's the most evolved organism? So there was a rotation involved, A to C. So I flipped those 4 organisms, and what happened to your answers here? All of a sudden, mammals became the most evolved species, but only when we're shown at the top of the tree, right? When mammals is buried in here in the middle of the tree, even though a lot of you bring that conception to class that we are the most evolved species, I'm glad you ignored that urge, but you went with a different urge, which was, it was at the top, or in this case, it was the left side of the tree when you saw it on the pole. And likewise, when we're at the bottom or the right-hand side of the tree. So it doesn't matter where on the tree a species is. So if you consciously recognize that, as we look at more phylogenies through the course, you'll do really well on exams.
Would it be safe to say that a species is more evolved the more nodes it takes to get to that species on a tree?
So something else we'll cover very soon. Does the number of nodes or steps that you have to traverse from the root to an extant taxon, like frogs, have anything to do with how evolved it is? So to answer that question, I'm going to pose a different one. What's not shown on this tree? So time is represented by one of the axes. In this case, the trees aren't drawn to scale with time. But what taxa are not shown on this tree? So we don't have bacteria, we don't have viruses, we don't have plants, we don't have insects,
Invertebrates in general.
we don't have invertebrates in general. How many species of birds are there? More than one, right? So I'm representing a huge group of species with just one branch tip. What about mammals? Not so many mammals compared to some other taxa, but there's a lot of species of mammals. Frogs, huge up here, most species are fish. I'm representing all of those species with just one branch tip. What would this tree look like if we showed all of the species for all of these taxa?
You wouldn't be able to decipher it.
You wouldn't be able to see branch tips because there's probably 10,000, 20,000 species up here. So if you drew a tree that size and you had 20,000 branch tips, I'm just estimating, you wouldn't be able to see anything. How many nodes would there be if you drew a tree with 20,000 different species? How many nodes would there be from the root to one of the branch tips? Probably about the same number of species, number of nodes. So in answer to the more direct answer to the question then, counting nodes, how many branches are there between the root and the species you're looking at? The number of nodes only has to do with how many species are on the tree. It doesn't have to do anything with how complex or how evolved the species is.
So you're saying maybe more how many species are in each branch? Is that what you're saying?
So-
Better idea to tell how much.
There is no way to tell how evolved a species is. It's just not the approach is not to just count nodes. So if you counted nodes here, you would say fish had one node. Frogs went through 1, 2 nodes. Mammals, the third node. So if we think birds are the most evolved, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nodes. That's not the way to do things, because the only reason that birds is the most nodes deep from the root to the branch tips is because it is one of the species that shares a most recent common ancestor. So it's got extra nodes on the tree. We could do the exact same thing for mammals. Aya?
So birds are only the most recently evolved taxa, not species.
Right, so in this case, there are many species of birds, so I'm just representing all the species with one branch tip. We could blow up that one branch tip that says birds into hundreds and thousands of branch tips. So fortunately, the good news is for the second question, most of you were reading the tree accurately and reported, regardless of which tree you were looking at, that it was that most recent common ancestor of birds and crocodiles. So at least 3/4 of you answered that part correctly. So you were looking at the shape of the tree, you were looking for that shortest branch, the most recent common ancestor, in answering relationships between species. So wherever birds and crocodiles were on the tree, most of you saw that and got that concept. But it doesn't matter where on the tree, and so we're going to do an exercise right now to try to get comfortable with both branch rotation, showing the same tree, and also the idea that who's at the top or the bottom doesn't really matter. Okay, so here's the practice. I'm assigning a Google Classroom assignment right now. All it asks for you to do is to take a screenshot and attach what you've drawn here to the Google Classroom assignment. So no PDF annotation or anything like that. So pick one of these 4 phylogenies, and as it says here, redraw it with either frogs on top of the tree or turtles on top of the tree. You choose, your choice. So I want the exact same structure of the tree. You can rotate branches around nodes. You just have to put turtles or frogs at the top. It'll take about 5 minutes to do this. Feel free to collaborate with a neighbor. This is not easy. This is not trivial. It takes me a long time to do these things too. It took me like an hour to put together that poll I gave on Friday. It's conceptually difficult, but give it a shot. Make turtles or frogs look like the most evolved species. This is very much like things that will be on assignment, so it's in your best interest to try this now, because we're going to get feedback.
Do you know a phylogeny for all 4?
Just pick one. It doesn't matter which tree you start with, because they're all the same tree. So start with A, B, C, or D, and redraw it in that white space on the left. Feel free to do multiple attempts. It doesn't necessarily happen well the first time, in my expertise. And then birds and crocodiles are sister taxa, the most recently evolved. What about the bottom submission? So fish branch first, frogs branch second, mammals branch third. Then turtles are the next group, and then crocodiles and birds share most recent common ancestor. So would the author of this, if you want to make yourself known, or if you drew a tree that was similar, what's the easiest way to accomplish this task of redrawing a tree with turtles on top, or frogs for that matter?
You just find the branch point where you want your organism and just flip it.
Okay, so let's say you want to put frogs on top, bless you, or frogs on the bottom, let's say. What would you do to tree D? I'm going to put frogs down on the bottom.
Easy way of just switching node 1 and 2. Rotating the 2 nodes.
Right. So you find the organism you want to draw on top or on bottom, you rotate whatever node it's attached to. So if you flip this whole thing upside down, you put frogs on the bottom. Pardon? Right. So it's worth exploring how to do this. Questions, concerns? So any node, you can pick and flip all of the taxa that radiate from that node upside down. So we're going to practice this more as we go through the next few days, because this is a really critical skill to have. Here we got a lot of them now. So try this one. So we've got mammals, bony fish, and sharks. Cartilaginous fish. Redraw this tree so that bony fish are on the top instead of mammals. So we want to have bony fish up here. Now what? Who's always going to be the outgroup? Sharks will, the one that branches first is always going to be the one that branches first, regardless of where you draw the tree. So there's our structure. Sharks will always be an outgroup. Bony fish are on top. So where do we draw mammals? It has to be in between. Has to be connected to the bony fish lineage because mammals and bony fish share a more recent common ancestor. That was true on the blue tree, and now it's true on the red tree. So all we did was take the node that connects to the taxon we wanted on top, and we just flip 180 degrees, rotate all of those taxa. So no matter how complicated the phylogeny is that I show you, because there will be some trees that have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of branch tips. Every tree is built out of one common structural unit. So every tree is just a series of one structural unit that's connected to other of the same units, and that's it. Every tree is built on combinations of groups of sister taxa. So let me prove it to you. Here, I've made the tree more complicated now by adding a blue taxon. So how do I represent this relationship now? Well, that's one group, that's another group, and that's their most recent common ancestor. So I could add a black taxon. There's a group of more closely related organisms to each other, and then there's the outgroup. So every tree is just a series of splits of branches.
Do you only call the two most closely related sister taxa, or are those?
Correct. So on any tree, it's the most closely related species that are called sister taxa. You wouldn't call, for example, the blue group, the two blue things I circled here, sister taxa, because there are more closely related individuals, these two red branches. So those are still the sister taxa. here in black would be drawn the outgroup for the full tree I've drawn. So I'm going to skip a few slides. We're going to come back to them next class. What I'd like you to do for next class, I'm going to launch a Google assignment now for you to do exactly the same thing. Draw a phylogenetic tree, take a screenshot, or make a new PDF, post it to Classroom. Here are different current extant, currently existing human and hominin populations. So humans, Homo sapiens, plus a few of our distant relatives. Bonobos and chimpanzees. So draw a phylogeny that you think best represents the relationships between these human and non-human populations. Post that to Classroom. Then also please read these three sections of one chapter rather, 4.3, 4.4, and 4.5. And we'll keep talking about phylogenies when we come back together. If you have